Disclaimer. The information, views, opinions, and thoughts expressed in the readings are of the respective authors. We, the producer and reader, do not claim allegiance to them in any way. The content and references should be perceived keeping in mind the period when it was written and not according to the present context. The limited but sincere goal of this series is to offer the listener unedited and original content. Thank you. The Music Book Club presents Pillars of Hindustani Music by B.R. DEODHAR. Translated from Marathi by Ram DESHMUKH. Read by Anuradha Kuber. Preface. In December 1947, the editorship of Sangeet Kala Vihar, the magazine published by the Gandharva Mahavidyalaya board, was thrust upon my protesting shoulders by Shankarrao Vyas. Conscious of the new responsibility fallen on me, I started writing. My first article, the late Pandit V.N. Bhatkhande, Person and Work, was written with much trepidation in January 1948. Among the first persons to read it was my friend Vamanrao Deshpande, who praised it and encouraged me to go on writing. I started drawing a pen portrait of a celebrated musician for each monthly issue of our magazine. When half a dozen of these sketches had been published in Sangeet Kala Vihar, I was agreeably surprised to receive a letter from the well-known Marathi writer, Professor N.S. Phadke, generously praising what I had already written and exhorting me to continue writing. Between 1948 and 57-58, nearly 70 or 80 biographical sketches must have appeared over my signature in the magazine. A select 21 of these sketches are being published in the present volume. If my luck holds and another similar anthology is ever published, I hope to be able to include in it other artists belonging to the last generation. Bombay, B.R. DEODHAR. Forward. Written by P.L. Deshpande. Amongst the few Indians I have come across who can be said to be striving for the development of music with a dispassionate eye on the traditional and the new, DEODHAR holds a very high position. There are many people who eke out a living as professional musicians by capitalizing what little they received at one time from their gurus. Every guru is, after all, a human being, and there are limitations to what a single person can do. It follows that if the seeds of a guru's learning are to be widely dispersed, his own ability and skill must be extensive enough to embrace all departments of his art. One might be tempted to attribute such wide-ranging proficiency to one's guru. But why allow misplaced devotion or loyalty to warp one's judgment? A mind which ceases to be inquisitive arrests its own progress. Obedience is a desirable quality within limits. To our great misfortune, our Guru Shishya or preceptor-disciple tradition became the repository of such sorts of attributes, good and bad, with the result that the art of music, instead of becoming a smooth-flowing river, degenerated into stagnant ponds. The stagnant ponds or puddles came to be regarded as sacred tanks, which became places of pilgrimage fit for location of tombs of saints and holding of annual fairs. And once it was established that prestige lay in belonging to a gharana, singing took second place to clamorous repetition of the Guru's name or an occasional sob. Persons who picked up fragments of a few cheeses merely on the strength of having heard them, had the impudence to claim to be the rightful disciple of some great musician, just because both came from the same town or its environs. Kinship to a gharana must be established by one's music, not by public invocation of the Guru's name. This sort of thing invests gharanas and gurus with a halo, whereas what is wanted is the ability, rarely found in the field of our music, to recognize and nurture whatever is beautiful in music. To identify new forms of beauty whenever you find them, and to collect these manifestations of art these tonal treasures with tender care for leisurely examination and assimilation. It was in this spirit that Professor Devdhar established friendships with talented musicians, vocalists and instrumentalists, belonging to diverse schools and styles of Hindustani music. He traced not merely the dimensions of their individual art, but the origin of their family traditions. He familiarized himself with their individual styles and their ideas concerning vocal and instrumental music. He observed their individual lifestyles closely, put up with their eccentricities, and nursed those who were ill and needed help. In persuading the more tight-fisted among them to part with their jealously guarded cheeses, he used both humility and cunning with equal deftness. Most importantly, he gave a new dimension to the musical knowledge of his students by giving them an opportunity to listen to the music, vocal and instrumental, of these master craftsmen. Strange as it may sound, some run-of-the-mill music teachers are resolutely against letting their disciples listen to music of diverse styles. This cannot be because of possible loss of tuitions, since tuitions in the old days rarely brought in any money. It is more likely that the reluctance to let disciples acquire a wide-ranging knowledge might have arisen from some queer idea about the sanctity of one's own tradition. Gharanas, like dens of fanatical sects, had become divided into sequestered and militant entities. A mehfil often degenerated into a righteous mob. In a Bombay mehfil, I have overheard remarks praising this or that musician because he hailed from a certain part of Bombay and not another a couple of miles away. Little wonder then that the Patiala adherents should regard distant Athroli people as beneath contempt, and Agra Gharana people should nurse hatred against those from Kirana Gharana and vice versa. On the other hand, there have been teachers who, having passed on all their knowledge to their disciples, urged them to go to another master to learn things which they could not teach. But by and large, there was reluctance to listen to musicians of other gharanas and a desire to lose no opportunity to insult or humiliate them. When a guru is afraid of his disciples being drawn to another tradition, he has neither understood music nor teaching. That is all one can say. Devdhar opened the doors of a dozen different gharanas for his pupils. He discussed with his pupils good and bad qualities of different styles and pointed out which characteristics to watch for and assimilate. He trained his students' voices as well as their ears, and he taught them what to look for and where. In short, he gave them vision. This is how Devdhar played a significant role in promoting his own gurus, Pandit Vishnu Digambar's ideal, which was to produce a host of Kansens. His school was not merely an institution for teaching music to those who were enrolled there, but a place where any music lover was free to go and hear music. Numerous artists gave recitals there. The artists whose life sketches appear in the present book are mostly those born around the middle of the last century, and all those stars and superstars, with the exception of Kesarbai Kerkar, have now set. Although the book principally aims at biographical sketches of some great musicians, but offers inevitably insight into the socio-cultural history of a period. By the time the British rule was firmly established, many of the musicians who are covered in the book had crossed their 40s. They had had to pass their childhood and early youth in a period in which access to learning, any kind of learning, was incredibly difficult. The prevailing social conditions were unimaginably different from what we see around us today. Music, but not musicians, had a place of honor in temples and palaces of princes. The melodious strains of the Shehnai formed the prelude to the puja of temple deities in the morning. But the Shehnai player himself, who made the whole atmosphere exhilarating, did not enjoy any social prestige whatsoever. Except when he was at the right end of the Shehnai, he had no place in respectable social circles. A musician, vocal or instrumental, is a citizen like everybody else, but society never gave him that status. The unfortunate appellation, a dependent, invariably clung to him. Devdasi and Kalavantin were hardly terms of praise. Today the word Kalavant, artist, is used as a mark of respect. Not so long ago, in fact, before Vishnu Digambar set about his historical mission, vocal music could be heard only in temples without any qualms of conscience. Otherwise, it had to be enjoyed on the sly. An occasional Raja or Nawab, if he happened to be a music lover, would befriend and extend support to musicians. But although their art was appreciated and they were paid well, no one thought of writing their biographies or putting on record their views on music. The study of Sanskrit declined with the onset of Muslim rule, and the decline of the tradition of study of the science of Hindustani music and allied subjects followed in its wake. Hindu musicians embraced Islam, and although the cultivation and practice of their art continued, they tended to drift away from Sanskrit and so from the theory of music available only in Sanskrit treatises. Authority in the style of "the old man said this or that, and our maestros sing thus or played thus" rested solely on tradition. A would-be musician had to serve his guru with dedication and accept unquestioningly what he chose to impart. The family treasure of learning belonged to the sons or the nephews, and the general tendency was to prevent outsiders from getting hold of it. The jealous guardians of family craft were afraid that in the hands of outsiders, the value of the heirloom, that is the rags and the cheeses, would go down. This fear is in evidence even today. The names of the rag are still withheld, and the words of the cheeses come out in a deliberately garbled form. In the old days, to be able to obtain a new cheese from the guru or to be able to learn the precise movement of a new rag involved tapasya, and it was questionable whether after one had gone through all that was necessary for becoming an accomplished gharana singer, one could earn enough to maintain himself and one's family. But even in those perversely inhospitable times, when one's reward could be no other than penury, misery, neglect, and ridicule, there were artists prepared to sacrifice their lives at the altar of music. The book records the lives of such artists. To obtain the biographical details of such extraordinary people is in itself a Herculean task. DEODHAR, along with his dedicated study of music, has tenaciously occupied himself for some 40 or 50 years with the lives of practitioners of this art. We claim to be very proud of our forefathers and our history. This is self-deception. Really speaking, we are extraordinarily indifferent to the life histories and achievements of our own ancestors. We appear very proud of people like Tansen and Baiju Bawra, but all we know about the lives of these great musicians is a few apocryphal stories. That is all. We do not seem to realize the need to delve into history. We hardly have records of the lives of great musicians, male and female, of the last generation. The reason is not that we are indifferent to the past. It is just that we are too lazy to treat the present with the importance it deserves. As against this, even the minutest details of the lives of Western composers have been faithfully recorded by numerous biographers. Let alone the notation of the composer's work, the original handwritten music sheets with the corrections made therein have been lovingly preserved. Since the discovery of sound recording equipment, great works of music have been preserved on discs and tapes for posterity. Succeeding generations would feel a sense of gratitude towards older generations only if they have left behind some worthwhile legacy. Even the top-ranking singers and instrumentalists of our generation look askance at any systematic effort on the part of respectable music colleges or other institutions to record vintage cheeses for the guidance of their students. They would rather allow the priceless treasure of which they are guardians to go waste after their death. In the field of music or dance, a sense of social responsibility is conspicuous by its absence. The involvement of professional musicians in the development of their own art is restricted to self-aggrandizement. Hardly anyone has bothered to record the history of the art, although obviously systematic recording of each important development in the present is an essential preparation for what future generations would come to regard as history. What we call the past was after all the present in times gone by. Unhappily, deprived of systematic recording of events and happenings at the appropriate time, history degenerates into a collection of anecdotal material of dubious value. People care little about Tansen's Gaiki, but everybody loves to talk about the rain-making prowess of his malar. We are compulsive deifiers of the dead, and since divinity is inconceivable without miracles, flights of poetic imagination were accepted as gospel truths. Tansen probably did produce a deluge of tans for his audience, but we turned it into a literal and not figurative downpour. Anecdotes about arduous riyaz came to be similarly exaggerated. If someone spent 2 hours on riyaz, the figure was blithely inflated to 20. But not a word was said or recorded about the method of riyaz itself, how the ancient maestros could effortlessly project their voices clear and true. In the old days, study simply meant cramming. Bade Ghulam Ali Khan reveals something of vital importance when he gives his personal formula for riyaz as day-long contemplation and half-hour's workout with one's voice, and follows it up by providing details of the workout. The account given by DEODHAR in the respect is very important. The duets fought by rival vocalists and instrumentalists are as interesting as war tales, but very often there is a tendency to exaggerate things in these narrations. DEODHAR has scrupulously avoided such exaggerations. The biographical sketches of musicians drawn by DEODHAR are nothing short of a history of the hard work done by men and women in order to achieve mastery of their art. Art was rightly regarded as something sacred by all those men and women. The times in which these artists lived were unusual. We were under British rule. The latter half of the 19th century was an era of special significance in the life of our country. People had perforce to come to terms with a culture far removed from their own. The lifestyles which existed for centuries were undergoing transformation. Cities like Calcutta and Bombay were beginning to grow at unaccustomed pace and in surprising ways. Gigantic machines were installed. In place of domes and minarets, one could now see huge smoke-filled stacks and chimneys of factories. Thousands uprooted themselves from village life and migrated to cities. Since the British administration needed clerks, school and colleges were geared to the production of clerical workers. The quarters where traditional craftsmen like goldsmiths, carpenters, and ironsmiths had lived for generations and practiced their inherited skills were beginning to be denuded. Children of all castes and diverse religions for the first time came together under one roof to receive training in technical institutes. Although the caste system still precluded mixed marriages and prandial get-togethers, there was now a great deal of relaxation of caste consciousness. Established religious practices were no longer strictly observed. Sons of Brahmins who had studied the 10 books of Rigveda became engineers and were building houses, and carpenters' sons were engaged in winding yarns around bobbins. A musician's son, even if he happened to have inherited his father's musical qualities, was no longer required to follow in his footsteps. There were many alternative avenues of employment. British ideas of etiquettes and culture held sway, and fluency in English became a social asset. Our literature and theatre were greatly influenced by English literature and ways of thinking. India was divided into two parts, Indian and Anglo-Indian. The only art which remained completely untouched by the cataclysmic changes all around was our music. Both Muslim and Hindu musicians preserved our own brand of music with the same doggedness and faith with which they might have guarded the sanctity of their holy Quran or Gita. It was in a sense a great blessing to our music that the practitioners of this art, by and large, did not come under the influence of English. There might have been an excessive clinging to traditional values and false pride in gharanas, but it was this fanatism which helped our musicians to retain the purity of their music. The life stories in the present book clearly underline this doggedness. Today, listening to music is a simple affair. The radio brought music into our homes, and now there is television. Both the musician and his music have free access to our homes. This is a most welcome development, but it has its own dangers. At the turn of a knob, the radio begins to spew music. One is reminded of the saying, familiarity breeds contempt. When the intervals between two broadcasting programs are sought to be filled by the playing of recorded music of Ravi Shankar or Ali Akbar, one wonders whether we have made music too cheap. Music is used to promote the sales of hundreds of products. This might open up the possibility of a music-minded soap manufacturer commissioning a new rag or a cheese named after his toilet soap. The art of painting has already branched off into a commercial form in the service of advertisers. The jingles being used on Vivid Bharati to promote the sale of toothpaste, laxatives, or aspirins are a standing testimony to the fact that commercialization of music is already underway. The snatches of music chatter and songs do not conform to musicology. Their real purpose is to seize the listener's attention, and once that is accomplished, to pitch in the sales talk praising their products to the skies. Vocal or instrumental music is an art, but it is also a means of livelihood. It can also become a marketable commodity. But if one wants to express the greatness of the art, it can only be done through voluntary acceptance of its laws. Once a musician accepts the basic framework of a rag, the quality of his genius and intelligence is determined by the variety of the tonal and rhythmic improvisations he can produce within the limitations imposed by the rag. Every artistic creation must conform to some set of rules. Freedom does not mean irresponsibility. There has to be a technique, and technique cannot exist without rules. Equestrian skill implies the technique of horseback riding. If the rider allows the horse to lead the way, he must lose the freedom to ride. The employment of a particular note merely because the musician feels like using it is not free exercise of art. The musician and his voice must be firmly in the saddle, and not a particular note or notes. Art degenerates if the artist allows himself to be excessively influenced by popular appeal, monetary greed, or similar temptations. As soon as popular appeal becomes the guiding principle, any meaningful discussion of art automatically comes to an end. Obviously, there has to be a rapport between musicians and his audience, but that does not mean acceptance of unsavory compromises. An artist who tries to woo his audience through such concessions earns popularity at the cost of respect. Popularity without respect for the musician's art is meaningless. DEODHAR in his book takes us close to artists who deserve such respect. He introduces us to them in a simple, straightforward manner. He has the greatest respect for these outstanding artists. He was on intimate terms with some of them, but in describing their extraordinary talents, he never loses balance or resorts to exaggerated praise. While building up the greatness of one, he refrains from downgrading another. He shuns apocryphal stories and scrupulously records his reliance, if ever, on hearsay evidence. In talking about vocal and instrumental musicians, he does not forget to pay due regard to a talented craftsman like the late Farid Sahib sitar maker. In drawing the pen portraits of these skilled artists, DEODHAR's own stance is that of an unpretentious student. What is more, he never forgets the role of an inquisitive learner whenever he talks to all these people. Although he was himself an excellent teacher, in the book he emerges as a perpetually questioning student. His self-portrait comes out naturally and clearly, rather like the emergence of the musical note Gandhar from two perfectly tuned tanpuras. A good teacher must keep himself up to date by constant study. In his School of Indian Music at Opera House, Bombay, Devdhar is both an excellent teacher and the best student. He introduces us to 21 artists who were masters of their art. Music lovers who were not fortunate enough to see these maestros in person would undoubtedly thank Devdhar for being introduced to them. The memories of those who saw or heard them would be rekindled. They will hear those magic strains once again and thank Professor Devdhar for recreating those magical moments for them. P.L. Deshpande.